Before they became one of the greatest rock bands in American history, the Eagles were just four young musicians chasing a dream. In the late 1960s, Glenn Frey, Don Henley, Bernie Leadon, and Randy Meisner each packed up their lives in their respective hometowns and headed west. Like so many others, they were drawn to Los Angeles, the beating heart of America's music scene at that time, where country rock, folk, and hard rock collided to create something brand new. What's remarkable about this story is how different their backgrounds were, yet how perfectly they fit together once they crossed paths. The music, the vocals, and for a time, even the personalities created a sound that reached out and grabbed listeners. When they finally came together as the Eagles in 1971, they didn't just form another band. They helped define an entire era of 1970s rock. With their mix of harmony-driven songs, country influences, and sharp storytelling, they quickly rose from being Linda Ronstadt's backup group to headlining their own shows. This is a story of how four strangers from across America found each other in Los Angeles and built one of the most legendary bands the world has ever known. Of course, there was another who came along early on into this journey, and without him, the band's story might have ended a bit differently. So stick around for this story of the early Eagles, how they all got to California and went from Take It Easy to Hotel California. Multi-instrumentalist Bernie Leadon was the first to come west. Bernie's father, or should we say Bernie's father's job, played the pivotal role in his son's move from Minnesota to California. Although the move, which was to San Diego first in the early 60s, didn't last long, and the family then moved across country to Gainesville, Florida, following his father's job. It only took Bernie a few years in Florida to realize if he wanted to follow his dream of music, he would have to get back to California. So in 1967, after failing to try to talk a friend and fellow musician named Don Felder into going with him, a 20-year-old Bernie headed west alone, winding up in Los Angeles, California. Bass player Randy Meisner's band, The Dynamics, played a talent contest down in Denver, Colorado. He said, "We got something like third or fourth place, but we didn't win. So we all headed back home to Nebraska." 3 days later, there was this guy in a really nice car, a GTO or something, pulls up out front and said, "You want to go to California with us?" And I said, "Wow, yeah." This was the Soul Survivors band member, Gene Chalk. They had also played the contest. He had borrowed his mother's car and drove from Denver to Randy's home in Scottsbluff, Nebraska to try and convince him to quit his band and join their group, since the bass player they had didn't want to leave Colorado to go to California. Randy joined the Soul Survivors. They would play a few gigs around the Denver area to get some money together and then head to Los Angeles, where they changed the name of their band to The Poor. This was the summer of 1966, and Randy had made it to California. Drummer Don Henley from Gilmer, Texas, just east of Dallas, was playing in a group at the time called Felicity, soon to change their name to Shiloh. They caught a break. Kenny Rogers was looking for a group to produce and took the band out to Los Angeles in 1970 and let them live with him for about 4 months and helped them to record an album. Nothing good really happened for the band Shiloh, except it got Don Henley out to Los Angeles, and it was there he would meet Glenn Frey. Glenn came from Detroit, Michigan, where he had become close friends with Bob Seger. They would write songs and record music and party together. Bob was about 3 years older than Glenn and was always encouraging him in his career. Bob recognized Glenn's talent and was the one who encouraged him to step out on his own. So in 1968, Glenn Frey took his friend's advice and made the big move to Los Angeles. The music scene in L.A. around the time the boys started to filter in was thriving. Randy Meisner was the first to get there, Bernie next, followed by Glenn and then Don. People came from everywhere. Joni Mitchell and Neil Young were from Canada. Stephen Stills and J.D. Souther was from Texas. Graham Parsons was from Florida. Linda Ronstadt was from Tucson, Arizona, and on and on. They all made their way to L.A. where it was happening, many of them hanging out at a nightclub called the Troubadour. The Troubadour Club started as a coffee shop on La Cienega before moving to its current location at 9081 North Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood. The word troubadour refers to a poet and musician singing tales of romance in 11th through 13th century France. Doug Weston founded the Troubadour in 1957 as a venue for folk artists and singer-songwriters to get together, socialize, and play their music. It was at the Troubadour that Don Henley would meet Glenn Frey. They had a few things in common besides the music, and being on the same small record label, soon became friends. Linda Ronstadt, who would play a big part in bringing the Eagles together, came out to L.A. in 1964 from Tucson, Arizona. She came out to sing with her friend Bob Kimmel, a singer and guitar player who also left Arizona to try to find a career in music in L.A. Soon after, they met bass player Kenny Edwards, who shared their musical tastes, and the three of them formed a group they called the Stone Ponies. The first of the soon-to-be Eagles to play in the Stone Ponies was Bernie Leadon. He did a fill-in on a short tour with Linda. This was some time before he joined the Flying Burrito Brothers in 1969, with whom he would be playing when Linda and her manager, John Boylan, needed to put together a band to back her up in 1971. The first one chosen was Don Henley. They heard him play at the Troubadour. Their next choice was Bernie Leadon, but he was playing with the Flying Burrito Brothers, so Don recommended Glenn Frey to play guitar. Randy Meisner was hired to play bass. He and Linda's manager, John Boylan, had known each other from Randy's playing with Ricky Nelson and from doing studio and sessions with him. So the band was in place, or so it seemed. Now, there isn't a lot of information on how or why Bernie Leadon came on board. It isn't really said if he quit the Flying Burrito Brothers or what happened, but something changed his mind after being asked. There are a few different stories out there from the band members on the sequence of the hirings. I think maybe Bernie Leadon was the first on their list, but he may have had some other irons in the fire and it was just kept quiet for a time. But either way, these four guys were going to put together a band for Linda and start rehearsing for the first time. During the first few days of playing together, Linda Ronstadt said, their voices were amazing. They had that perfect blend. You could tell there was something there. During the tour with Linda, Don and Glenn became close friends and talked about keeping the band together after the tour. Once it was talked about between all four members and the decision was made, they told Linda that after the tour was over, they were going to stick together and see about getting a record deal for themselves. Linda said she totally understood and wished them the best. The Eagles were signed in 1971 to Asylum Records, a new label started by David Geffen, who was introduced to Glenn Frey by Jackson Browne. The four founding members of the Eagles were to record 4 albums together before multi-instrumentalist Bernie Leadon was to finally walk out and quit the group. The songs from those albums were to make up one of the greatest hits album ever put together. Released by Asylum Records on February 17, 1976, the album titled Eagles, Their Greatest Hits, reached number 1, where it stayed for 5 weeks. According to the Record Industry Associations of America, their greatest hits, 1971 through 75, has been certified platinum 38 times. That's 38 million copies sold, and has become officially the biggest selling album ever in the United States. Could anything ever top that greatest hits album? Of course, the answer is yes, and it was named Hotel California, which has now outsold the greatest hits album. Although not a founding member, guitarist Don Felder was brought into the band in 1974, and he had played on the 2 albums before Hotel California, On the Border and One of These Nights. But it will always be the song Hotel California that he will be known for. The iconic song came with a lot of hard work and a lot of controversy, too. everything from the lyrics and even the originality of the music which Don composed. So let's move on here with the story of Don Felder, his early days with the band, and the song Hotel California. Don started playing guitar when he was 10, after trading a neighborhood kid some cherry bombs for a beat-up old acoustic. And in 1963, Don was to meet Bernie Leadon. Bernie's family had moved from the West Coast to Florida, and him and Don were to become close friends and bandmates. Their music tastes varied, as Bernie was into bluegrass and country, and Don into rock and blues. But they seemed to have a tight bond, and it would be Bernie who, after he left Florida and went back to California, would keep on Don to move west, where he said the music scene was really happening. And when Don finally did decide to go, it was Bernie who opened his home up to Don, his wife, and dog, and helped him get settled in and find some work on the West Coast. But after moving out west, it wasn't long before Don would finally get a call from Glenn Frey to help the Eagles out in the studio. The first Eagles song Don was ever to play on was the slide guitar on A Good Day in Hell, and later that night, he added some guitar parts to the song Already Gone. These songs were to appear on the On the Border album, and Already Gone would also be on the Eagles' Greatest Hits album. The morning after he helped cut those songs, Glenn Frey called Don at home and offered him a full-time gig with the Eagles. This was in 1974, and Don would remain a full-time member of the group until he was fired in 2001. In between that time, he was to play on and write on some of the greatest songs in rock history. And of course, the one most discussed was Hotel California. Don wrote the music to this song at his rented beach house in Malibu. On the advice from Bernie Leadon, after he first joined the group, he had told Don, if you want to write songs with Henley and Frey, just make musical beds for them. Don't try to give them full songs with lyrics, because that's their job. So ahead of making what turned out to be the Hotel California album, Don said, I wrote 15 or 16 demo songs based on that approach. 2 of them ended up on the record, one of which was Victim of Love, and the other became Hotel California. When talking about the music to Hotel California, the question always comes up, was it taken from the Jethro Tull song We Used to Know? Before I give my opinion on it, let's take a quick look at a couple of other well-known cases of plagiarism with songs I'm sure you're all familiar with, and see how they ended up, and then we can compare. George Harrison's song, My Sweet Lord, was the subject of a plagiarism lawsuit, where he was found to have subconsciously plagiarized the 1963 chiffon hit, He's So Fine. The court ruled that Harrison had indeed borrowed the music phrases from He's So Fine without conscious awareness, leading to a $1.6 million payout to Bright Tunes Music. Do those 2 songs sound similar? Yes, they do to an extent. Now, the Beach Boys didn't get sued for Surfin' USA by Chuck Berry, although Brian Wilson said he wrote the song using Berry's Sweet Little 16 as a template. Why didn't they get sued? Well, once threatened by Berry and his publishers, Brian's father and band manager Murray quickly signed over all publishing rights of the song Surfin' USA to Chuck's publishers. Brian and the boys never received a penny from that song and didn't know about it until years later. Those 2 songs, Sweet Little 16 and Surfin' USA, have very similar melodies and chord structures. So what about Hotel California and Jethro Tull's song We Used to Know? Are they similar? Felder's chords are the same, just picked and voiced a little different. Did Tull have a lawsuit? Well, if they did, it would have probably been the richest one in the history of music. So why not take a chance and challenge it? Well, I guess there are some people out there in the music business who are a little different than most, and Ian Anderson is one of them, and here's what he had to say about it. The Eagles were opening for Tull, and We Used to Know was in our show. This was in 1972. So it is possible, sure, Ian Anderson said, but after all, there are only so many notes. Sooner or later, something's going to sound like something else. Did they do it intentionally? He said, I doubt it. And I don't care. They made a better song out of it than I did. Yes, the Eagles did open for Tull in 1972. Back then, Don Felder was still living in Boston at the time, and he did go and see his old friend Bernie Leadon when the Eagles came to Boston during this time frame. But when Felder saw them, they were opening for Yes at that show, not Jethro Tull. Bernie had called Don and invited him and his wife Susan to this show and to hang out. It was at this show Don was to meet Glenn Frey, Don Henley, and Randy Meisner for the first time. In my opinion, I highly doubt Don Felder had Tull's song in mind when he was sitting around playing those chords. The melody does have a few similarities, but with the same chord structure, you would expect that. So I guess the bottom line is, would there have been a case had Ian taken them to court? Probably, maybe, who knows? But one thing I do think I know is, had the shoe been on the other foot, I'm sure Henley and Frey's lawyers would have been all over it. But Ian Anderson was cut from a different mold. So what are your thoughts on this? If you're not familiar with the Jethro Tull song in question, I'll put a link in the description and you can listen to it for yourself and see what you think. Comment section's always open for your thoughts on this subject. I'm curious to hear what you all have to say. What made the song so great? Well, anyone can name that song in the first 5 notes of the great intro. The lyrics paint a picture in your mind while listening to it, and everybody can recognize the leads at the end of the song. And this is not looking at this song from a musician's standpoint. This is looking at the song from a person who only knows how to play their radio and stereo. The song was wrote by musicians and they sold it to everyone. The whole concept of that album was just a masterpiece, and it all started with Don Felder's guitar work. So where are these 5 members now? Bernie Leadon left the group in 1975. Of course, that wasn't the end of the Eagles, but I do believe it was the end of that great sound that started it all. Bernie's 78 years old now. Last I heard, Bernie was living on his farm just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and was happy. He still writes songs, plays and records music, and even has a new album. You can look up his music on Spotify. Randy Meisner, the bass player with one of the most beautiful voices ever, passed away in July of 2023 from COPD. He will always be known for his lead and harmony vocals and that incredibly high note he hit on the live version of Take It to the Limit. Randy was to quit the Eagles in September of 1977. His singing, songwriting, and harmony was so important to that early Eagles sound. Glenn Frey passed away on January 18, 2016, at the age of 67 from complications of rheumatoid arthritis, acute ulcerative colitis, and pneumonia. He was considered the leader of the group in the beginning and played a big part in getting them signed to Asylum Records. He was a singer, songwriter, guitar and piano player, actor, and painter. Don Henley is still kicking at 78 years old and has kept the Eagles going after the passing of Glenn Frey. He started out playing drums and singing harmony early, but ended up singing the lead vocals more as time went on. Out of the 5 #1 singles that the Eagles produced in their career, Don Henley was lead vocalist on 3 of them. Don Felder is also 78 and still hits the road and plays shows with his band, bringing back all of those classic Eagles songs. Now here's a couple more videos I think you'll enjoy if you like this one. And if you would, hit the thumbs up button for me and subscribe to the channel. Let's help keep it alive on YouTube. Thanks.